In the back seat, remove the carpet right here. There is a twist lock, twist that, and slide this out of the way. Make sure the seat is all the way back, and then grab this trim piece and just pull straight up. There's some locks that hold it down. Use a T20 socket, remove this screw, and grab this cover, slide it up and outwards. Use a 10mm socket, loosen up the negative terminal, grab the connection, and just slide it out of the way. Take this ground connection off, just use a 15mm wrench, loosen it up. Now disconnect the weather stripping right here, and on the other side we're going to remove this panel. There's a whole bunch of push pins throughout the truck. Just use a trim tool, get underneath there. If you have to, some of them are tight, you can use a pick and take all those off. Just grab that panel and slide it out. Take this cover off, there's a cap, take the oil cap off. And grab the cover, slide it up and out of the way, and just so nothing falls down in there, put the oil cap back on. Take the fuse box cover off, there's a couple locks on the side, push down on those. Now pull this cover off. Use a 13mm socket and remove the nut. And take the wires off, out of the way. Use a 10mm socket and loosen up these two screws. This is what connects the connectors to the bottom of the fuse box. So the bolts are not going to come out. Give it a couple turns. And that should be good. And the fuse box is clicked in with all these little tabs. You're just going to have to go around the fuse box and lift up on the tabs. Just use a straight blade screwdriver. Pry up on the box a little bit as you're doing it. And in the back as well. Sometimes they click back in. And just slide up. And if the connector is still connected, you might have to loosen up those screws again. This connector is two harnesses connected together. And if you flip it over and use a straight blade screwdriver, in between here, there's a tab. You can slide that tab over, and then you can separate them. Just like that. There's the little tab. And this connector, just pull this out to the side. Then this plastic housing comes up. Just use a small screwdriver, and move these tabs over. And it slides up and out of the way. And there's a connector right here. You can just slide up underneath here with a trim tool. There you go. You can disconnect the connector. Just push down on the tab. Separate the harness. Then this moves out of the way. And there's another harness right here. We'll just slide up underneath that. This one you don't have to disconnect. Just disconnect it from this panel or this plate. And there's a bolt right here, and there's two nuts over here. Use a 10mm socket and take those out. And grab the plate and slide it off. Take these two bolts out, use a 15mm socket. And you can slide this mount out of the way. And just slide it out. There is a slight gap right there. It's a little easier to slide that out first. To get this reservoir out of the way, I'm just going to take these three bolts out. Use a 10mm socket. And just grab the reservoir and slide it up. We're just going to spin it around, just leave it right there. This bracket, I want to remove this out of the way. There is two 15mm bolts right on top, but this hose is in the way and I don't want to disconnect that. So the lower bracket has two 18mm bolts. There was one there and there's one over here. So use an 18mm socket, loosen those up. And just take those out. And just slide the bracket out. Before we take the serpentine belt off, we just want to loosen up these 10mm bolts. Just use a 10mm socket. This way the pulley doesn't spin. Just crack them free. And if you have to, use a 10mm wrench. And I'll just use a wrench for the last one. Now when taking off the serpentine belt, if you can access the tensioner right here with a tensioner tool, you can remove it from up top. We're going to remove it from underneath as if we were just doing the serpentine belt. Remove the wheel, use a 22mm socket, take the lug nuts off, and remove the wheel. Remove these two push pins, just use a trim tool or a screwdriver. And just slide this out of the way. Take a serpentine belt tool with the correct adapter. This is a 1/2 inch adapter. Get that lined up in the tensioner right there. And loosen this up. And just slide the belt off the crank pulley. And you can take the tensioner tool off. And we'll take the belt off underneath the tensioner and slide it off the power steering pump. And off the water pump pulley, off the alternator, off the idler pulley, and off the AC compressor. Now if you're doing the water pump, you don't necessarily have to take the belt off completely. You can just slide it off the water pump pulley. Now we can remove these bolts for the pulley. Now take the pulley off. Make sure the vehicle is cold, and I'm going to take this cap off just to relieve any pressure. Now this vehicle, the radiator does not have a drain. You can double check on yours to see if you want to drain some of the coolant out, but we're just going to have a drain bucket underneath the water pump. Now we're going to remove these bolts around the perimeter of the water pump. There is 6 of them, 3 on top and 3 down below. Use a 10mm socket. And I'm starting to see some coolant, so make sure you have a drain bucket underneath. And take all of those out. There's the last bolt. And if you can, just pry this off. And there's some of the coolant coming out. I'll just let that drain. All right, now just take this out of the way. Now take the old gasket off. Be careful, this is very sharp right here. Slide that off. And then you want to clean up any of the gasket material, so take a razor blade or a scraper and just get all of that off. You want it as clean as possible. Be careful not to score the engine or the timing cover. Now just take some brake parts cleaner and a rag and just wipe it down. Make sure it's nice and clean. Now take the water pump. This part right here, where you see the little cylinder where there's a little plug, that goes towards the bottom. This is the top. And take the gasket. The gasket only goes on one way. So if you have it on that way, it doesn't line up, flip it around the other way. And don't put any sealer on the gasket or anything. Now line it up. And get the bolts started. Now we're going to torque these bolts, and there is a specific order you should be torquing these in. You start with the top one, that's number 1, then go straight down to the bottom one, that's 2. This top to the left is 3, then down to the right is 4, then back and lower is 5, and then the last one is 6. The first sequence, you tighten these to 89 inch-pounds. And it is recommended that you replace these bolts when you're doing this job. Then the second pass, you're going to go around again, do 89 inch-pounds again. Do the same sequence. And in the last sequence, if you have an angle meter, do the best you can. If you don't, you're going to tighten these 45 degrees each in the same sequence. Now we can put the pulley on, line that up. There is holes where the water pump is, and those line up with little divots in the pulley. And put the bolts in. Now do the best you can, tighten these up. You can snug them. And then once you get the belt on, you can snug them up a little more. Now take the belt. I'm going to slide it underneath the tensioner first. And go around the power steering pump. And up over the water pump. And over the alternator. And come around to the idler pulley. Around the AC compressor. And when you get to here, then you can get your tensioner tool and slide it over the crank pulley. And there you go. Double check all your pulleys. And I'll put this flap back down and put the push pins in. Install the wheel and the lug nuts. Now I'm going to torque the lug nuts to 140 foot-pounds in a cross pattern to tighten the wheel down evenly. And just go around again, double check. With the belt on, I'm just going to snug these bolts up a little more, just because it will hold the pulley from spinning. Now install this bracket. And snug these bolts up. And I'll put this mount in, just slide it back in position. And get those bolts started. And tighten the bolts down. Slide the reservoir back into position. Get the bolts started. Install this plate. Make sure the wiring harness is pulled above it. You go over this stud and over this stud. And get the bolt and the two nuts started. And tighten them down. Now secure this connector together and then lock that down in the retainer. Just push it down. And then this one over here, just line that up, push it down. And this lower fuse box cover, get that lined up. Lock it down. This connector is going to go right here. And then these two are going to connect together like that and rest right there. And take the fuse box, line it up, lock it down. Then you can take a Phillips head screwdriver and just slowly tighten this up. And there's a little window right here. As you tighten this up, once the connector gets to the top, you can see this little orange tab thing. And right there, when you tighten it and it releases, you know that's tight. Do the same on this one. Now take these cables, put this one down first, the one that has the little ear there, and then the longer one goes on second. And take the nut, put that on, and snug this down. Put the cover on. At this point, you want to fill the coolant up right here where the radiator is. You could use a funnel. And when it's all full, you want to start the engine, let the engine run for about 10 minutes. Make sure you monitor the temperature of the engine, make sure it's not overheating. If it starts to overheat, shut the vehicle down and repeat the steps. Otherwise, you can leave the heat on just lightly, make sure there's heat coming out of the dash. After it's run for about 10 minutes and everything has cycled through, you should be able to shut the vehicle off, let it cool down, adjust the levels, and you should be good to go. You put the coolant cap back on. You can also check the level in the reservoir right here, adjust that level as well, and put this cover on. Put all the push pins back in. Put this ground terminal back on and just snug it down. And put the engine cover back on. And the oil cap. Now reconnect the battery and snug this down. Make sure this is not loose. Put the cover on and the screw. Tighten the screw down and just line this up. Lock it down and put the carpet in place, and then you can twist the lock.